Welcome, everyone, to this month's Diane Rehm Book Club. My name is Lauren Centrella, and I'm the Director of Development here at WAMU. WAMU's mission is to connect listeners and members like you to each other and the world. We proudly offer you this opportunity to be curious and explore relationships through the conversations of the book club. First, a little housekeeping to assist in your participation today. If you'd like to ask a question, please do so using the Q&A function found at the bottom of your Zoom screen. If you'd like to access closed captioning, please click the CC button also at the bottom of the Zoom screen. Like everything we do at WAMU, this book club would not be possible without your support. If you enjoy the discussion today, please consider making a gift online by visiting dianerehm.org/give. And now it gives me great pleasure to introduce Diane Rehm.
Thank you, Lauren, and welcome everyone to the November meeting of the Diane Rehm Book Club. This month's selection is The House of Doors by Twan Ang, longlisted for this year's Booker Prize. The novel transports readers to 1920s British Malaya. The story weaves together two actual events: a visit to Penang by author Somerset Maugham and an Englishwoman's murder trial in Kuala Lumpur. Joining me to discuss this tale of love and secrets, colonialism and revolution, Kelly Mee Rich, professor of English at Harvard University; Louis Bayard, author of 10 novels, including Jackie and Me; and Sheela Jane Menon, professor of English at Dickinson College. We'll take your questions throughout our discussion. You can type them into the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen, and we'll try to get to as many as we can. And welcome to all of you. I'm so glad to have you.
Great to see you, Diane.
Thank you.
Thanks so much for the invitation.
Lou, I'm going to start with you. This novel is really centered around Somerset Maugham, and I found myself being a little surprised at that. He's not exactly the foremost novelist of our time, but he was in his own time, was he not?
Oh, for sure. I mean, it's funny. I was having this conversation with a friend, a very well-read friend. I said, I'm reading a book about Somerset Maugham. And she said, well, that's kind of obscure. And I had to laugh because if we were having this discussion 60 years ago, there would have been nothing obscure about Somerset Maugham. He was one of the most famous writers of his day. At one point, the highest paid writer in England. And he was successful across multiple platforms. He began as a fiction writer, writing short stories and novels like Of Human Bondage, probably his most famous one. Then he also became a highly successful playwright with hit plays in London and New York and around the world. And then also his stories and plays were adapted into highly successful films. So he came at people from a lot of different directions, and there's no way that anybody could shrug their shoulders about Somerset Maugham. But yes, today he's a more obscure figure. The one thing that we can do that we couldn't do 60 years ago is talk more frankly about his sexuality, about his private life, and about colonialism, the way it was portrayed in his work.
I wonder whether the incidental fact of his having real money trouble was actually factual, Lou.
I believe it was, yes. He lost pretty much all his money in investments. In fact, there's a key point in the novel where he gets word of that. It's not the happiest news. But the thing to point out is, I think the book is set in 1920, so he is already a famous man. He is a public figure, and wherever he goes, there is press attention. There are people vying for his attention, and at the same time, he's prospecting for material for future stories, and that's what he does here in Penang.
Of course, he's married to Siri, who's back in England, but he doesn't love her. He loves the young man he is with.
Yes. That was a marriage of a marriage of convenience, basically, for Mom. He would have grown up. He would have been around 20, I think, when Oscar Wilde was tried and sent to jail for sodomy. So he had to find an arrangement that would suit the public, the British public, because of course sodomy was still a crime. The other complicating issue was that his lover, Gerald, who was so posing as his secretary or acting as his secretary, had also been deported from England. So they could not go back there together, which is one of the reasons Mom rarely went back to England at all. In the rest of his life, he was very much an outlier.
Do we assume that his wife, Siri, knew of his homosexuality before they were married?
I don't know. That's a really good question. I mean, I think there would have had to be some kind of discussion along those lines, because understanding, I mean, they did have a child together. So there were at least there was at least at some point some kind of sexual relationship. But no, I mean, I think it was really protective cover that he was looking for. And she was at least happy to supply it as long as she was funded in the style that she wanted to be.
Now, Kelly, what are your own thoughts about sort of resurrecting Somerset Maugham?
Yeah, I mean, Somerset Maugham is such an interesting and kind of counterintuitive figure to recuperate in the way that Tan Twan Eng does. Nobody really writes about him anymore, I would say, in literary criticism or assigns him in their classes. And I think part of the reason, and I'm sure we'll get into this, is that he seems rather conservative in certain ways in terms of his literary style and his politics, both of which we might call old-fashioned, but were very much of his time. But as Lou says, he was a very popular writer and a very complicated figure in terms of his personal life, I think, which are aspects that Eng really draws out really well. And I think I read this book as being in conversation with other contemporary novels that take on a project of literary recovery, particularly of queer historical figures. So I'm thinking of Koim Toybin's The Master on Henry James, Monique Truong's The Book of Salt, Gertrude Stein and Alice B. Toklas through the perspective of their Vietnamese cook, Bin. Michael Cunningham's The Hours as well, resurrecting both Virginia Woolf and the character Clarissa Dalloway. The list can go on. But I think what distinguishes this project of literary recovery is that it's such a complicated braid of historical figures, events, time periods, locations, not just Somerset Maugham, but of course, Ethel Proudlock, the first English woman to be charged with murder, which I think is the most interesting and riveting part of this novel.
Me too, I agree.
Right? Yeah. And of course, Sun Yat-sen, and to some degree, I think Oscar Wilde as well is a really key figure, and he's already come up in our conversation. So it's also so richly intertextual. It's recovering in some sense Maugham's own writing as well as his kind of historical figure.
Indeed.
So it's almost too much to hold together in your head at one time. You can really tell he did his research.
Well, Sheela Jane, let us not forget Leslie, the primary female character, aside from the Proudlock murder. But it does seem to me that she is such a force, not only in her own right, but she's an early force for womanhood and standing up to those around her. She has her own thoughts, she has her own ideas, she is willing to express them, even if it means disagreeing with those around her. What did you think of her?
Yeah, as I was listening to Lou and Kelly, I kept thinking that so much of my attention was focused on Leslie as I read. I was actually a little bit surprised that Ethel's trial comes quite late in the novel.
It does.
And in some ways for me, and I'm curious if you all had maybe very distinct reading experiences, Leslie's voice sort of dominated my reading experience. The depth and intricacies of her interior world, her emotional struggles seemed to keep coming to the foreground, even at times over Willie's narrative in the text. I think to your question, Diane, I think Leslie is a complicated narrator for this text. I think, yes, she is an interesting figure through whom to think about questions of women's agency, women's freedom, particularly in this time period, particularly in relationships and marriages that turn out to not be fulfilling, turn out to not be what she expected. And she's also, in many ways, a particular kind of colonial voice of her time, right? And she brings with her British colonial prejudices about locals, about Chinese people in particular, both Chinese communities in British Malaya and Sun Yat-sen and China as an entire world and landscape. And the freedom with which the novel expresses at times a very direct racism, a very direct homophobia that come out from Leslie, the same character who at times I also felt very deeply the angst and frustration as she vocalized the double standards that the men in her life, the men of her time, had about what freedom looks like, what a marriage is supposed to constitute, what a woman's role in a marriage should be. So I think I just found her to be such an intricate, conflicted character in the novel, and someone whose voice is also the frame narrative, right? She opens and closes the text for us. And that first person narration really at least brought me much closer to her interior life and world, and her complexities and failures and triumphs as a character, even more so than it did Willie, for me at least.
Willie, to your point, Willie is told in a close third.
Right.
And there is a difference. There's a difference of intensity, and I agree with you. I think Leslie's voice is the more vivid of the two.
On the other hand, though, she's a failed writer of her own story. She tries to write it, right? But she needs Willie Mom to actually narrativize it for her. So I think there's a really interesting question about who is the primary protagonist, even though she is so dominant in exactly the ways that you mentioned, Sheela Jane.
Yeah, absolutely.
One further idea that is the parallels between Leslie and Somerset Maugham's wife back in England, both married to men with whom they are frustrated. Leslie keeps her frustration at a very low level, whereas Siri goes into hysterics every time the thought of separation or divorce is mentioned. I thought that was kind of an interesting diagonal to have the two in the same kind of situation. The children play almost no role. The children that Leslie and her husband have. What about her husband, Kelly? Leslie's husband. He's so quiet until Willie shows up. And then he seems to blossom with the presence of Willie and his, quote, secretary.
Yeah, I mean, Robert is an interesting character. He's also a lawyer, right? So in terms of thinking about this from a law and literature perspective, he does give us some of that substance there. But there, I think Willie animates him because as it turns out, as we learn, he was having an affair with Peter Ong. And there's this, that to go back to Sheela Jane's point about Leslie's colonial views, there's a moment, Leslie not only says, we had a pair of bloody homosexuals under our roof when she thinks about Willie and Gerald, but there's a moment where she says, the thought of Robert in bed with another man and a Chinaman too, right? So it's almost like the transgression is doubled, and the most unthinkable thing is miscegenation or crossing racial boundaries. So he actually turns out to be, in some way, a more complicated figure than we might initially give him credit for. Also, he brings World War I and the sort of post-war period, the I don't know, the shock of shell shock for everybody as the cause of them moving to South Africa into the picture as well.
What do you think, Lou, about the fact that Leslie's narration is first person and Willie's is third person? How do you see that difference, and what does it do?
Well, that's a good question. It's a close third, which means it's sort of third person merged with first person. You're as close as third person can get to being first person, but there is still this distancing. I had the opportunity of talking with Twan when he came through DC to do a book event at East City Books, and one of the things he said is he didn't feel he could do first person for Mom because that would be trying to imitate his voice, which is very distinct to Mom himself and to his work. So he felt it easier to come at him as in third person. And then Leslie, I think, just needs that vividness because the character of Willie initially dismisses her as just another bored, colonial housewife, right? So I think she needs those kind of that first person to bring out some of that inner complexity that Sheela Jane was talking about.
I must say, go right ahead, Sheila.
Could I just circle back to your comment about the children in the novel who sort of disappear? It's interesting to me just to note that Leslie and Robert's children are useful to the narrative in one way, for me at least. They are the vehicle through which we get one of the few local Chinese voices in the novel. And that's their nanny, right? Who is also Leslie's nanny. So this is a domestic worker who's been with this family across 2 generations. And she is a voice that emerges more often than other local voices, except maybe Arthur's in the novel. And she's also a woman who has a level of assertiveness and familiarity and a capacity to give advice and perspective, even if only in small moments, to Leslie. And she's one of the few local voices that has that kind of power, that kind of visibility in the novel. And so I don't even think of the boys so much as I do that they are references to them are moments to hear from her. And I'm kicking myself now because I can't remember her name. Is it Ah Meng? Am I remembering that right? I was flipping through as we're talking, but I think I just wanted to flag that as a woman, and she's a woman who makes Leslie and Robert's life and lifestyle possible in the novel.
And on that very issue, we have a question from Francesca. Do you think the Chinese characters are somewhat diminished or flattened because we see them mostly through Leslie's eyes? Kelly?
Great question.
That's such a great question. And I think a really big question for the novel would be what, as much as it includes, and it includes a lot, as we've discussed already, it doesn't focalize any of the Chinese characters as a main or even kind of properly main secondary character, right? Even though we do get these flashes, and I think Peng, the ama or the nanny, also gives us access to a bit of Leslie's history when we go see her with the letter writer, right?
Mhm.
But even that moment, we see Leslie's gaze on her. The interest is that she can't write, right? And that she can't read, and that she's speaking these words to try and memorize what the letter writer is reading aloud. So I do think, the question would be, how would this be a different novel if we were given Sun Yat-sen as a main
Exactly.
character,
Or
right?
Robert, yeah.
Yep, yep. Or Arthur, yeah, exactly.
I'm sorry, Arthur. And it's more intense because the author himself is native Malaysian, so it's an interesting
Yeah.
choice in his part to
Yeah, I think there's also there are two quick thoughts. I kept wanting to hear, in addition, and going right along with what Kelly and Lou were saying, the collective of local Chinese community members who were active every day in the Tongmeng Hui and in the fundraising and publicity efforts for Sun Yat-sen. This is a space that Leslie was entering once a day for an hour or two. And I found myself, again, also as a Malaysian reading the novel, I was even more interested to imagine how the book raises questions of what anyone in that space might be thinking or doing or saying, and what might happen if some of those voices were intermingled in the novel. But to your point, Kelly, there is already so much in this novel. The other thing I'll say is that I think it's interesting to note and important to note that across his three novels, Tan has taken a narrative approach that in really interesting ways looks at Malaya through the eyes of colonial powers, right? So Japanese diplomat in The Gift of Rain, the self-exiled emperor of Japan, the gardener of the emperor of Japan who's self-exiled to Malaya, mixed race characters, colonial characters in this novel. And so I think there is also a trend in his writing that prioritizes these different voices to offer distinct vantage points, perhaps, on questions of history and memory in Malaya. And in that sense, I think he's also doing something different than other transnational Malaysian writers of his cohort. So writers like Tash Ah, Prita Samarasan, YZ Chin are focusing more on Chinese and Indian voices in particular in their work. And so I think that places Tan as part of this cohort, but also offering us in his literature different kinds of viewpoints into this time period.
I must say, I was fascinated with Sun Yat-sen because I thought it was with him that Leslie hoped to have a physical affair. But we have another question from Barry. Is it possible that the author left those Malaysian voices out on purpose? Is he trying to say that the British really didn't see them at all? What do you think, Kelly?
I want to jump in here. So I actually, personally, this is a confession, I've never read Somerset Maugham until this moment. And I went back and I read The Casuarina Tree, that the letter, right, the short story that sort of galvanized this novel. And there's this really complicated postscript to this short story collection in which Somerset Maugham writes about these small communities in the countries, I'm quoting him, washed by the China Sea, that they're very sensitive and that they get agitated if details of their lives get revealed. And he goes on to say they have small acquaintance with arts and letters. And so they don't understand. They're not good literary readers. They don't understand that his characters are amalgamations of multiple sources. And so I think the question, to go back and ask this question of why not Malaysian characters in this novel would be, are there moments of of kind of like autocritique or self-critique that these European characters give us, or that the narrator and the sort of narrative commentary give us? And I do think there's one at the end, and this is a very metafictional moment, but there's a moment on 296 where she says the people, or where Leslie is thinking, the people he had met, he being Willie, in the Strait Settlement were furious with the stories he had written about them. He had betrayed their trust, and he had not even taken the trouble to disguise the names.
Yes,
So I thought
exactly.
that was a really interesting point, and a point that we might hold on to say, maybe exactly as this question is asking, the flattening is purposeful, and this novel draws attention to that flattening as a form of critique. Does it do so in an extreme way? Not necessarily, but I think that's a really interesting moment to focus on.
Why do you think Leslie decided to tell Willie, Somerset Maugham, the whole story about the murder? What do you think of that, Lou?
I think there is a confessional moment, isn't it? She's talking about the crime of Ethel Proudlock, I think was the name, but she's also confessing her own in effect crime, or if you will. I just think I get the sense in that moment of a deeply lonely woman who needs a friend and finds an unlikely one in Willie Maugham, and
who also needs to be recognized herself
and remembered.
And remembered, as she says at the end of the book.
And I love that. Actually, I love that she's as I think Sheela Jane said, she's the opening and closing act. So everything is refracted finally through her eyes. But interestingly, too, she's not the one who tells her own story, so she doesn't write it down herself. She has to, in effect, get a letter writer to come and do that for her, which is also interesting and maybe a comment to her.
And actually, the narrative she tells Willie, very little of it appears in what he writes, because he chooses to maintain her social standing and not violate the expectations of the time. So it's also, I think, there is some level of maybe implicit dissatisfaction in the novel that in the writing that finally emerges of her life story. It's not the full narrative that she had shared with him, which makes me also think that maybe her narration of her story to Willie becomes the only record that remains, right?
But she doesn't really know the whole story. It's not until her husband tells her the real story that it finally comes out. We have a question from Tom. To what extent is the book a response to the story, The Letter, or even the 1940 Betty Davis film of the same name? The three renditions seem all to end differently. How many of you have seen that movie with Betty Davis, Lou?
A couple of times. It's if you're gay, you have to. It's just one of those required things to do. You got to see The Letter. It actually had an interesting. It started out as a short story in the collection, the Casuarina Tree. I can never pronounce it correctly.
Yes.
And then it became a very successful play, and then was made into a movie a couple times. But Betty Davis's is the most famous version, and it becomes a little more melodramatic each time with each iteration. But it's still fascinating. I was watching the 1940 movie again recently, and it starts out with the natives, and they are strictly extras. It's very exotic lighting, very exotic music. It's very atmospheric, but we never really get a sense of an inner life from anyone. So this is very much the story of these white British colonials. The great reverberating climactic line is Leslie saying, I still love the man I killed. So even though she escapes punishment in the courtroom, she will always be haunted by the fact that she killed her own love, that she killed the possibility of happiness for herself. So
well, it's so interesting that we do learn that her husband, that is Proudlock's husband, had planned the whole murder. I mean, it's shocking, but explains her attitude toward him in the courtroom. That was quite a trial, because Leslie is sitting there, and of course she knows the truth, or thinks she knows the truth. And there is the Proudlock woman sitting on the stand telling lie after lie, rape and self-defense, and problem being that the guy was shot in the back of the head.
yeah,
That doesn't quite sound like self-defense to me. How did you
I think it plays into the hysteria around sexuality, and women were supposed to be, a fate worse than death. I think that was the old Victorian melodrama line. So the idea that a woman would kill to defend her honor, I think, was accepted, legal defense accepted in that culture at that time.
There's also an element of racial hysteria, to go back to the question of that the listener asked about the similarities between the letter, at least the short story, and this. So I think that the hidden force of both of them, the letter ends with what is revealed is that the lover had a Chinese woman living with him, and that was the point that drove this woman, I think, to murder. And in this case, the reason why Ethel stood on the stand and told lie after lie, as you're saying, is that she was A, going to be divorced from her husband, and B, disowned from her father. And that was even more problematic because she was an illegitimate child, and her mother was rumored to be Eurasian, mixed race. So I think that I think there is that really interesting kernel that then is rewritten in this novel, but that still holds true for both of them.
And I think go ahead.
I was just going to say, I think it also links the question of truth and lies, of what the different characters think they know about each other and what they don't know about each other. I think there's a thread between that, and perhaps implicitly or subtly in the novel, or for us as readers to pick up on, what these characters think they know about local life, what they think they know about the Chinese community in Penang, and what they actually don't know. And I think that's illuminated to some extent in Leslie's relationship with Arthur. Her own prejudices, her own racism bumps up against who Arthur is, what he does in the world, even if it's only revealed in a limited way in the novel. And so I think there is an interesting triangulation of what is understood to be true, seen, believed, and maintained socially for the British colonials in this society, and what they think they know and don't see about the local community, including a prosperous middle-class community of highly educated, highly literate, particularly Chinese, but also Indian and to some extent Malay members of the society who were immersed in business and the arts, but who are not seen to be so by the British community of the time.
Here is another question from Laura. What do you make of the fact that Leslie was so upset by her husband's affair with a Chinaman, and then her great love turns out to be Arthur, who is straight Chinese? What do you make of that, Lou?
Well, one thing that struck me too is they use the phrase Chinaman in this book, and that was, of course, completely a phrase of that time. It would actually be stranger in some ways if they didn't. But that was just a way of kind of stereotyping, typifying, and isolating a particular ethnicity. I just think it shows that we're all messed up, that the human heart is not logical, that we're not consistent. We're not consistent about anything except whom we love or are attracted to. She also, as we said earlier, she makes it talks about the bloody homosexuals, and then sort of comes around on that too. So I think she definitely grows over the course of this book.
Yeah.
We know that Sun Yat-sen leaves their small town and goes back to China to fight his revolution. He really was a rather large figure historically, was he not, Kelly?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that the thing that, in some sense, the question of what would the novel look like if he had been included as a focalized narrator, I think, I can't remember where in the book this is, but somebody was describing his three loves, and his last love was China, the one that's always going to betray him, right? Or the one that's never going to be consummated in some way. And so I think like that to me is the shadow that's hanging over this novel that gets invoked, but not necessarily fully spelled out because its attention is elsewhere.
Yeah, I think too that that historical Sun Yat-sen as historical figure, Sun Yat-sen as character in this novel, also illuminates the really complicated diasporic connections between Straits Chinese and different generations of Chinese communities in British Malaya and Malaysia of the present and China, right? And the novel doesn't refer to the meeting this way, but that 1910 fundraiser meeting that is referenced in the novel, that we are actually in that meeting in one chapter, that becomes known in history as the Penang Conference, and is seen as a fundamental historical moment that facilitates the successful rebellion that Sun Yat-sen leads. And so that places Penang and Straits Chinese and the diasporic ties between British Malaya and China in very close and influential proximity.
What
It's
is
I was going to say, it's such a complicated world they're living in. You have layers of caste, layers of race, layers of gender, colonialism. There's so much going on in so many scenes. Everything is kind of seething beneath this kind of placid surface. Sorry.
So that's why we have to talk about the title, The House of Doors. So many doors, and they're hanging and they move, and Leslie has one which is not marked, but the other doors are all marked, painted with certain symbols. What does the title mean to each of you, Kelly?
I was just thinking about, while you were talking, we've talked a lot about this novel as a historical novel, right? But I think that what The House of Doors brings to us, as well as that really beautiful scene of our two protagonists swimming in the ocean, the illuminated ocean, right?
Yes.
I think that the title brings a certain literary time to our attention. Events, The House of Doors, that might not make it past the threshold of recorded history, right? We may not have any record of this house, this kind of magical, beautiful, artistic, floating world house. And yet it's so resonant for the novel. And so I think that the novel deserves to be spoken about in terms of, these ahistorical elements.
For me, the doors are complicated symbols because they can be leading you somewhere, opening out somewhere, or they can be closed and blocking access. Behind closed doors, are the old phrase. So in a sense that there can be screens, and every character in this book has some kind of screen, which they open only very reluctantly, maybe at some point for one person or two people. They're all hiding behind these doors, in effect.
And the screen for Leslie is that she has insisted that her lover, Arthur, not write her a single letter, anything that could be discovered. And it sort of makes me think about the veil of these doors. There was this veil between the two of them, truly, I think, in love with each other. Didn't you think, Sheela Jane?
Yeah, I think as complicated as the power dynamics are there, I think the novel renders that relationship as one of love and intimacy and freedom, but always enclosed, always shut in, and always preserved in a space that's encircled by these doors, right? And I think I completely agree with Kelly and Lou's readings. And I'd add one that's maybe a little more prosaic or a little more spatial in some way. I think the fact that Arthur, the literal House of Doors in the novel, is an act of preservation on the part of Arthur, who is saving these doors from, if I'm remembering correctly, old shop houses, right, in Penang that are going to be demolished. That act of preservation and the reference and description of the doors, to me, illuminates the way the novel signals or shines a light on an image that, for me as a Malaysian living in the US, is iconic of old towns and the shop house districts of Kuala Lumpur, of Penang. These are markers of a very rich cultural, communal, physical, spatial history for Malaysia and for Malaysians. And these buildings are constantly at risk of being torn down today, while others are being preserved. So for me, there's a really evocative cultural significance to the title, to Arthur's act of preservation. And I'll just say, it might be of interest to you all and to your readers, the house in which the fundraiser takes place for the Tong Meng Hui, that house is purchased in 1930 by the family of a local historian, Ku Salma Nasution, and she has spent decades restoring that house. And it opened in the early 2000s. It reopened in 2023 for the first time post-COVID. It is now the Sun Yat-sen Museum in Penang.
Oh,
Wow.
So I think that question of preservation is both metaphorical and also really urgent and literal in Malaysia today.
that's really interesting. Thank you for that. A question from Jean. Could any of you see the writing style of Somerset Maugham in this book? Do you think Maugham was an influence on Tan's writing? Lou?
Well, it's interesting because Maugham is not really known for his prose style. He wrote in a very plain way, often resorted unapologetically to cliche. He was really very much about telling the story in the most direct possible way. And I think I would say Twan's work was much more literary than Maugham's. His descriptive qualities, some of the complexities we're getting at in terms of the internal life. So I think it's Maugham's prose as filtered through a more refined aesthetic. That's kind of how I feel.
And to follow up, here is a question. Tan is a Malaysian, yet this novel from the beginning seems like a book in service to the British Empire culture more than a place for the people of the former colony to be heard. What do you make, pardon me, what do you make of Tan's choice to speak for the colonial culture more than his own? reading it felt like shopping in British India or the East India Company, to department stores in Kuala Lumpur that peddle nostalgia for the empire.
Mm.
I'm happy to take a stab at this question. You know, I think I'll just be very frank and say that I had conflicted feelings reading this novel, in part because so much of the work of Malaysian literature from the 60s, 70s, 80s through to this new generation of 21st century transnational Malaysian writers is about thinking through what it means to be Malaysian through literature, through history, through memory, and through the voices in English literature, particularly of Indian and Chinese communities who are minorities in Malaysia, right? And so there's been a long development of Malaysian literature that's working to amplify non-colonial voices in the rendering of Malaysian life and history. That being said, I also found in my reading that it's quite evident that we are reading colonial voices who are rendered as such on the page, and whose smugness and sense of superiority and colonial racism are visible to a thoughtful reader. And so I think the question is, what do we take away from seeing British superiority, British racism, British hypocrisy rendered on the page in a novel like this? What does that contribute to this new body of Malaysian literature? And then what do we take away from the novels and plays of K.S. Maniam, Prita Samrasran, Lloyd Fernando, Tash Ah, who are centering Malaysian voices as part of what scholars of Malaysian think of as a body of literature that is articulating creative resistance and critique of state and colonial power. So I think these different kinds of novels are offering different windows into that project.
Go ahead, Kelly.
Yeah, thank you. That's great. And I would just add, I also felt conflicted, but I think I was tracking it from we're thinking about telling a British story a British colonial story rather than a Malaysian story. I think there's two interesting data points we might consider. The first is to go back to this no letters, no notes. That's Leslie's citation of the trial of Oscar Wilde to some degree, saying what Wilde taught us is that these forbidden affairs can leave no paper trail, right? And so I actually read the novel as a form of repair for her, that she says, I actually now want to tell my story to some degree because I wasn't allowing myself to have this paper trail with my one love, Arthur. On the other hand, so you could make an argument that if we read this novel as a legal novel to some degree, the most important precedent is the 1885 La Bouchere Amendment that sentenced Oscar Wilde to prison. On the other hand, I think Ethel's case is really interesting because, as the novel notes, she ultimately puts her fate in the hands of the Sultan of Selangor after having been refused a royal pardon from the king. That is a British pardon. And so the real shock of her trial to some degree is that she acknowledged another authority other than her proper sovereign, we might say, the British sovereign.
And she is dismissed by the community,
yes,
because of that very fact.
And the outrage over her choice to do that, there's a line about how can we allow a sultan to exert power over a British subject.
Yes.
I'm paraphrasing the exact lines in the novel. Apparently Tan said he took straight out of a newspaper clipping from the time. So this was something that was actually published in print that a British community member had written into the newspaper saying that, and he lifted that line into the novel.
And that's on page 2. Oh, sorry, go ahead.
That's all right.
Oh no, I was just one more point on that. That's on page 256. I noted that as well. And really interestingly, is lifted as a quotation. So Robert says, Ethel Proudlock has damaged our prestige among the natives. And then that quote that you paraphrase, Sheela Jane, is in quotations, but it's not attributed. So I do think that Twan is putting that there for us to kind of search for, to note. Again, I think that's a kind of form of internal critique, we might say, that this novel's offering us.
One person we haven't talked about is Gerald. And I am interested that the author himself has called him the most honest and the happiest person in the book. Your thoughts, Lou?
Well, he's happy because his life is getting paid for him in part. I mean,
Yeah, absolutely.
he gets to travel around the world, all expenses paid. But I that's an interesting idea, because he is in some ways the least complicated one. He just wants to give and receive pleasure from life, and he doesn't care where he is in the world. He's just there for that basic pleasure principle. In reality, Mom and Gerald stay together for the rest of Mom's life. So there was something about this bond that was enduring. Whether it remained sexual the whole time, I can't say, but they meant something to each other, and I think that does come out in the course of the novel as well.
Mom was so afraid he was going to leave him, because Mom had lost his money,
Yeah.
at that one point. How did he gain back his money? Was it from the publication of additional books that did very, very well?
Yeah, I think mainly he was a prolific writer, and as I said, very successful. I think the novel noted at one point he had 3 plays playing in the West End at the same time. So he had future hit plays, and so he was a workhorse. He kept putting it out there. And I think he had a very good commercial sense of what people wanted to see, that it needed to be a little bit racy, but not too much. I think he really had a way of pushing against taboos without violating them completely. So he was working through the rest of his life, mostly, I think, at least until the 1950s.
Here is a comment from Gabrielle. Another short story referenced throughout the novel is the Mom story, Rain. I found and read that story, and again, it shows Mom's adversity to religious stridency. He was raised by his austere preacher uncle after both parents died by the time he was 10, and social dictates in his sympathy for Sadie Thompson, a bold young woman who happens to be a hooker. Any comments there?
Well, Sadie Thompson is one of the most famous characters in 20th century literature. That's a kind of name that you could have thrown out again 60 years ago. People would have known exactly who we're talking about. But it is a story very much about the hypocrisies of religion, and that was something that he clearly experienced firsthand.
And in thinking about Ethel and Leslie, what parallels do you see there between the 2 women? Sheela Jane?
Yeah, I couldn't help but think, as I was reading, about 2 women, both having affairs, both operating within societal expectations, but choosing to make different choices and take different levels of risk. And 2 women who share those parallels and yet are operating at different ends of the social ladders. And so I think in that way, Leslie and Ethel's stories illustrate the varying levels and shared levels of constraints on women's lives, women's agencies, women's vulnerabilities, and the choices they have to make, and the risks they're willing or not willing to take. And so I think they're a certain kind of foil for one another, but showing us the risks, the opportunities at different ends of the social spectrum.
And both finally give in to their husband's wishes. Ethel decides to move to South Africa, which she doesn't want to do. And
Leslie, rather, right?
Leslie and Ethel concedes to her husband's order that she kill her lover. So really a sad look at the state of women, even strong women.
And also illuminating the fact that patriarchy shapes colonialism, shapes experiences of gender and sexuality. And so in that sense too, right, the constraints that are placed on Leslie and Ethel share some parallels with the constraints placed on Willie and Robert and Jerry as gay men, operating under the strictures of patriarchal dominance, right? But playing out in distinct ways.
Did you all feel as though this book truly had a happy ending, Lou?
I think the happiest ending it could have, given what they're up against. I find it happy. I feel like Leslie in that final epilogue has gotten to a place of understanding and perspective on her life and its experiences, and is at peace with where she is. But maybe that's just me wanting a happy ending for her. I don't know.
Do you think she does go back to Arthur, Kelly?
I mean, you kind of have to, right?
Yeah.
I think that it does, the ending brings the two of them held together, even though they're in very different moments, held together in one place in time in only a way that literature can. So I think that, yes, that suspension is hopeful, even though I think that Liz is right. I mean, she still puts out a glass of wine for her deceased husband every day. Maybe she wants 2 glasses of wine. I don't know. But I think it's also a way to honor him and to say, these are the choices that I've made, but there's still this horizon at the end of the novel.
The last line implies that she is headed to Penang, that Arthur is waiting for her in the House of Doors. And I'm going to be a bit of a contrarian and say that I'm not sure that I found that a happy ending, because I was left wondering, how does Arthur feel about this reunion? And also, how does Arthur's, if I'm remembering correctly, he has a wife and daughter or daughters. What happens to that? What has happened to that marriage in his long distance and now upon his return? And what are the stakes there?
Great point.
Oh, Diane, I think you're muted.
That, and I am afraid we're going to have to end our wonderful conversation here. It's been a joy to talk with the three of you. Thank you so much, Kelly Rich, Louis Bayard, and Sheela Jane Menon. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Diane.
Pleasure.
And in about 15 minutes, I'll be interviewing Twan about his career transforming the rich stories of his native Malaysia into best-selling fiction. You can still register for that at the link in the chat. For our end of the year gift to you, the Diane Rehm Book Club will feature Episcopal Bishop Mary Ann Buddy, whose new book is titled How We Learn to Be Brave. It will be available at 1:00 Eastern on Wednesday, December 27th. We'll send out a link so you can watch it Finally, before you go, please fill out a short survey about this event that will pop up on your screen. Our book club is produced by Allison Brody. Ellie Dickman is our events director. Our engineer today is Adrian Danhauser. And with the support of Leslie Van Sant, Kennedy Wright, Carly Cloud, Lauren Centrella, Verinder Silva, and Michelle Morgan. A special thanks to all of them and to you. I hope to see you next month. Thank you so much for joining us.